are coming on the air with a bunch of new developments on that deadly July 4th parade shooting. We are just now learning the names of 6 of the 7 people who were killed in that suburb just north of Chicago. Coming up, part of my conversations with the town's mayor, along with new details about what we now know about how this person of interest disguised himself to escape the scene and his previous contact with police. And what we're hearing today from the White House after WNBA star Brittany Griner basically begged the president to help get her out of a Russian prison. President Biden, well, we know he's read that letter. We're going to have more on what Griner's wife wants him to do now. Plus, new details on the death of NFL star Demaryius Thomas. Researchers say he struggled with CTE, what his family is saying at this point. Plus, a bigger boat's not going to stop a shark if you're already in the water, right? The nightmarish details from one man's encounter with the shark and why climate change may mean these attacks happen more often than ever before. And in tonight's Originals, hackers could have a new target, your heart. Why experts say pacemakers and other medical devices could end up being threatened. That's later on in the show. Hey, I'm Hallie, and not too long ago, maybe within just the last half hour, we learned the names of 6 of the now 7 people who were killed in that awful shooting on the 4th of July. They range in age from 35 to 88 years old, 3 women, 3 men. 5 of them killed in their hometown of Highland Park. They are Catherine Goldstein, Irina McCarthy, Kevin McCarthy, Jacqueline Sundheim, Stephen Strauss, and Nicholas Toledo Zaragoza from Mexico. You see their names on your screen now. In just about an hour from now, hour and change, we understand that the Lake County Sheriff's Office has said that the state's attorney's office could announce charges against the person of interest in this shooting. It's after they said officers visited this person's home before, twice in 2019, after a family member said he threatened to kill everyone.
The police responded to his residence. The police removed 16 knives, a dagger, and a sword from Cremo's home. At that time, there was no probable cause to arrest. There were no complaints that were signed by any of the victims. The Highland Park Police Department, however, did immediately notify the Illinois State Police of the incident.
This comes as we're getting our first look at this photo. Officers say it's that 21-year-old person of interest dressed up in basically women's clothing. They say he was trying to disguise himself to be able to slip away after firing 70 rounds from a high-powered rifle. Those shots, of course, turning that celebration into a nightmare, leaving 7 families in immense grief today. One of the victims, Nicholas Toledo, was 78 years old. He's on the left there, a grandfather who was at the parade with his family. Jackie Sundheim on the right, she was 63, a former preschool teacher. Just 2 of the 7 who died Monday. 12 other people are still in the hospital. Deputies say this person of interest had apparently planned this attack for weeks, for several weeks. Arrested in nearby Lake Forest some 8 hours after the shooting when somebody saw the car he was driving and called 911. He had some of these online profiles that showed mass shootings. He performed as a rapper who went by the name Awake. The most recent video posted showed him in the aftermath of a school shooting and ends with shots of him draping himself in an American flag. Pete Williams has more on that part of the investigation, but I want to start with Dasha Burns, who is in Highland Park. And Dasha, some really significant updates from the sheriff's office here. Specifically, more information about these 2 contacts with law enforcement that happened in April and September of 2019, and then a couple of other buckets I'm going to talk about with Pete in a second. Fill us in.
Yeah, Hallie, in our second update of the day, we got more details on a question that had come up several times earlier this morning. I asked law enforcement officials in the first press briefing today about whether he was known to law enforcement, this alleged gunman, because of all of the social media posts that we've seen now, those disturbing videos. You know, I was wondering whether or not the police had any information about this before. They said they did not know about the videos, but that they had known about this individual before. Well, we just got the update on their interactions with Robert Crimo, and here's what they told us. 2 prior instances, as you mentioned there, Hallie. In April of 2019, someone contacted the police department a week after learning about a suicide attempt. The police spoke with Crimo, spoke with his parents, and said that in that case, mental health professionals handled the situation. There was no need for police intervention. A second incident in September of 2019, a family member reported that Crimo had threatened to, quote, kill everyone, and that he had a collection of knives. In that case, the police did intervene. They took the knives and they reported the incident as well to state police. The question I had after all of this was revealed, though, Hallie, was when it comes to these videos, if if community members had notified law enforcement about some of the threatening things that had been posted online, would that potentially have prevented this incident? Could law enforcement have intervened then? And the answer was kind of a muddled one, right? And I'm sure Pete has more on that. But they basically said with red flag laws in the state, with the way that these incidents are handled, it's really a case-by-case basis. But they did say that if a community member sees something on the internet, flag things to law enforcement, that is always more helpful, Hallie.
Here's what the mayor of Highland Park told me just within the last maybe 2 hours or so when I asked her about the impact of this on this suburb, on this community. Watch.
There is violence, and that is terrible. And you read about it and you think, wow, that was a horrible thing to happen to that community. When it arrives in your front yard and you see what an unbelievable impact it has physically on human beings and emotionally on a community and how it's tearing these families apart, these people need to know this is not okay.
It's coming as we are learning more about these 7 people, with 6 of the victims now named. We showed pictures of 2 of them. And I think it's really important, Dasha, in these moments and in this just makes you sick to your stomach, right? To think about how often we have to cover this, how often we have to think about how we cover these kinds of mass shootings. But one thing we want to do is center the victims, make sure that we are highlighting who these people are, whose lives were stolen. People like Nick Toledo, a grandfather. People like Jackie Sunheim, that former preschool teacher. We have pictures of those 2. We're obviously working to find out more about the rest of these victims. Do we know anything else? There have been reports about some of them elsewhere in other outlets, Dasha.
Yeah, well, we know the youngest victim that we know of so far was 35 years old, Irina McCarthy of Highland Park. The oldest was 88-year-old Stephen Strauss. And again, that's so far, even since we spoke last. Hallie, a 7th victim, a 7th person has died. And we know that at least one of the individuals hospitalized right now is a pediatric patient, a child. And the people that I spoke with here today, Hallie, described this community as Pleasantville. This is a tight-knit, really a community where a lot of people want to live, right? This is a place people aspire to move to send their kids to school, and to have this happen here is so heartbreaking. You know, some of the folks who were there were here at this press conference talking about how they sit at the same place on that parade route every single year. This is an event that people come to every single year. These are human beings. These are community members. Everyone here is somehow affected by this, Hallie.
Dasha Burns, live for us there in Highland Park. Dasha, thank you. And I know you're staying close to a camera as we expect more updates from officials in the area later on. Pete, let me bring you in on this. Pete Williams is joining us now with more on the investigation. So let me start with what we anticipate. Let me start with what we've learned so far just in the last hour, and then what we anticipate happening in the next hour. So what we've learned in this last hour, these 2 law enforcement, they call them contacts, basically interactions that the police have had at any point with this person of interest. There were 2 of them that they described, one in April and one in September of 2019. In September of 2019, they took knives, something like 16 knives, a dagger, a sword from the house. Those were taken by police. The situation was referred to Illinois State Police. We heard from a state police spokesperson there wasn't much they could do because at the time, this person of interest hadn't applied to try to get a gun in the state.
That's right. And so here's the question. There are 2 questions here. Number one, the questions came up at some of the questions in the news conference about red flag laws. So Illinois does have one of those laws. It was passed in the spring of 2018, and it does apply to firearms. But the way it works is someone in the person's family, or someone who's a close relative, or someone that has that kind of relationship, has to make a complaint that has to then be investigated and then referred to a judge to temporarily take away that person's firearms. So in 2019, according to the police, Robert Crimo didn't own any firearms. So the red flag law wasn't an issue then. One question what came up is, well, after he bought the guns in apparently 20 and 21, why didn't someone complain? And of course, I don't know that the police would know the answer to that question. The second thing is that to get a firearm in Illinois, to buy one, you have to have what's known as a firearms owner identification card. You heard the police in the news conference refer to that as a FOID, F-O-I-D card. And according to the state police, one of the disqualifying factors for getting one of these cards is this, and I'll just quote, "Not be a person whose mental condition is of such a nature that it poses a clear and present danger to the applicant or any other person in the community." Now, what I don't know is how do the state police go about determining that? And would the record of their encounter with him, the notification that they got from the police in September of 2019, become some kind of a record that would have been used by the state police who issue these cards to make that a disqualifying factor? And I don't know the answer. I think that's something we're going to have to find out.
Police say that he had 5 firearms, rifles, and handguns. Pete, let me talk about what should happen or what we expect to happen potentially next hour, which the Lake County Sheriff's Office alluded to, potential charges against this person. Do you have any sense of what they may be? We're looking at state charges, obviously, not federal at this point, no?
Yes. Right. So there'll be state murder charges, state charges relating to the other people who were injured, and then a number of other charges incidental to it, using a firearm in commission of an act of violence and so forth. There's no indication that we know of, Hallie, that there are going to be any federal charges here. The federal government would get jurisdiction if there was some suggestion that the shooting was motivated by racial animus or religious animus, and so far we've been told there's no indication of that.
Pete Williams, live for us with the latest on this. Pete, thank you. I'm going to ask you to stay close to a camera, too. I know you will. I appreciate it. It's not just Highland Park, by the way. Folks in Philadelphia are still feeling rattled after gunshots at their own July 4th celebration. The city's police union is now offering a $20,000 reward for whoever hurt 2 officers in a shooting during the fireworks celebration near Philly's Museum of Art.
Oh, God. Oh, God. Oh, God. Oh, God.
You can see that video of people panicking, people scattering across the Ben Franklin Parkway. This is about 10 p.m. Those 2 officers are out of the hospital now, but scenes like this are exhausting the city's mayor, Jim Kenney, he says.
I don't enjoy 4th of July. I don't enjoy the Democratic National Convention. I didn't enjoy the NFL draft. I'm waiting for something bad to happen all the time. So I'll be happy when I'm not here, when I'm not mayor, and I can enjoy some stuff.
So you're looking forward to not being mayor?
Yeah.
NBC's Emily Aketa is in Philadelphia. And Emily, our local NBC station in Philly, owned station there, sat down with Mayor Kenney today. He has clearly heard the criticism from those comments he made. He says resigning is not on the table.
Hey there, Hallie. That's right. Yeah, some strong words from Mayor Kenney, as we heard there, eliciting some strong reaction from a lot of the residents here. He says, walking back some of his comments today, saying that he's speaking out in a point of frustration, a point of a lot of emotion. He says he loves to be Philadelphia's mayor, and he wishes, and he conveyed his emotions differently, saying he was disappointed in the words he chose. Take a listen here.
I just think that was a human emotion, a human expression. Would I say it again there? No. I'm proud to be mayor of the city. I'm happy I was reelected. As a person, sometimes it gets frustrating and you emote.
And this comes as Philadelphia continues to battle a stream of gun violence. It's one of at least a dozen major U.S. cities, setting a grim milestone last year, setting new highs for the number of people murdered in 2021. Hallie.
Let's talk about the survivors of the shooting, because we're hearing about the apparently miraculous way that one officer survived from the Philly police commissioner, right?
That's right. And I think the best way to describe it is through a picture. If we have a picture here, it shows the cap of one of the police officers. He was grazed by a bullet in the forehead. And in the edge of that cap, you're going to see a bullet. So you think about it, the gunshot, whether it was an inch left or right, this could be a very different situation. And that's something the police commissioner acknowledged last night. Take a listen.
It is miraculous. Again, the fact that the round stopped in his head. It initially, I think, went up the inside, hit his forehead, and then the round stopped in his head. We're happy that we didn't lose them or anyone else tonight.
And Hallie, still a lot of unanswered questions when it comes to this investigation. Police say it's not clear if this was an intentional shooting, if those 2 police officers were being targeted, or perhaps it was, quote, a celebratory gunfire of sorts where the bullets had ricocheted off the ground and just struck the officers by happenstance. Hallie.
Emily Aketa live for us in Philly. Emily, thanks. We got some breaking news out of Georgia tonight, where a Fulton County special grand jury has issued subpoenas to key members of former President Trump's inner circle. We're talking about people who were close to Donald Trump. Senator Lindsey Graham, you see him here, John Eastman, Rudy Giuliani, Jenna Ellis. They're all being required to appear next Tuesday. It's part of a criminal investigation into election interference and whether former President Trump broke laws by trying to overturn the 2020 election in Georgia. NBC News has reached out to Giuliani and to Graham for any response. We haven't heard back yet, but Blaine Alexander is in Atlanta following the story. So, Blaine, we've got the subpoenas. I know you've had a chance to look through them. I've skimmed them myself. It feels like the significant piece of this story here, Blaine, is just how close this grand jury is now getting to the inner circle, the people who were closest to Donald Trump at the time that he was, you know, spreading lies and misinformation about the election fraud in 2020, of which there was none.
I think that really is the most notable thing about this, Hallie. We're talking about 7 different subpoenas of people that were extremely close to him in those crucial days following the November 2020 election. We're talking, of course, about Senator Lindsey Graham, Rudy Giuliani, some of the president's legal team. But I think what's notable when you kind of look at these subpoenas, when you go through them, read through them, they lay out why the grand jury believes that they either had knowledge or in some ways played some sort of role in Trump's alleged interference in the 2020 election here in Georgia. So, for instance, let's just look at the subpoena for Lindsey Graham, for Senator Lindsey Graham. The grand jury in that subpoena, they point out essentially saying that Graham made 2 phone calls either to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger or to members of his staff in those days following the election, asking about absentee ballots. And I want to read a quote from that subpoena just to make sure that I get this 100% accurate. They say, in order to explore a more favorable outcome for President Trump. So they're saying that he wasn't just asking about them, but asking, essentially saying, could they be changed? Could something be done in order to get a more favorable outcome? And then also repeating those now debunked claims of election fraud, widespread voter fraud here in the state of Georgia. Similar when we talk about Rudy Giuliani, they're pointing back to those December 2020 testimonies that he made before Georgia state lawmakers here in downtown Atlanta, essentially showing video evidence that, of course, has now been widely debunked, showing what he claimed to be at the time suitcases full of false ballots, fraudulent ballots. Of course, that's something that's been debunked many times over, but it's something that really led to what are still spread false election claims here in the state of Georgia.
When you look at the overall investigation from the district attorney there in Fulton County, one of the pieces on this, you look at the way that a sitting senator, right, Blaine? I mean, Senator Lindsey Graham, who is serving in office now, they're investigating what they say are a couple of calls that Graham made, not just to Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, but to his staff. Graham has said the call was appropriate, right? How much does that figure into the investigation, and where does it go from here?
You know, I think it has it figures in a large way. Of course, we're talking about that. We also, of course, are talking about the thing that kind of kicked this whole thing off, which was the phone call that President Trump made to the Secretary of State himself, asking him to find some 11,000 votes. But when you look at these phone calls, you know, we know that Brad Raffensperger has already testified. He testified before the special grand jury last month. We know that he was a key witness. So the fact that when you kind of look at the timing of this, look at the fact that Lindsey Graham has been called, certainly it's going to be a portion of what this grand jury is looking into. I think another thing that's important to point out here, Hallie, is that because these are people who were out of state, the Fulton County DA had to petition a judge to sign off on these subpoenas. So the judge did sign off on these subpoenas for these 7 witnesses. There's also a timeline that we're looking at. In the subpoenas, they say that they need to appear sometime between July 12th and August 31st. So kind of a window that we're looking at to see these people come forward and testify, Hallie.
Blaine Alexander live for us there in Atlanta. Blaine, thank you so much. And as we talk about developing news related to former President Donald Trump, here's some more. Because in just the last couple of minutes, the January 6th Select Committee has announced they're going to hold their next hearing a week from today. So that's Tuesday, July 12th, 10 a.m. Eastern. No word just yet on the specifics of this hearing. We know that they had previously laid out this kind of 7-part plan. We don't know how the testimony of Cassidy Hutchinson, for example, last week may be changing things up for them. July 12th, by the way, is the day that the House gets back from recess. So they're basically coming back in from vacation, screaming hot, getting ready for this hearing. You will see, of course, special coverage right here on NBC News Now. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre confirming not too long ago that President Biden has read the letter that WNBA star Brittany Griner sent directly to him, asking to get her out of a Russian prison. The administration says it's doing all it can to bring her home, but the State Department today not getting into specifics, they say, for fear of jeopardizing her release. In the letter, Griner writes, in part, as I sit here in a Russian prison, alone with my thoughts and without the protection of my wife family, friends, Olympic jersey, or any accomplishments. I'm terrified. She says, I'm terrified I might be here forever. She says, please don't forget about me and the other American detainees. Please do all that you can to bring us home. Griner's wife, Sherelle, was out today saying their family wants a meeting with President Biden to help speed up the process. You'll remember Griner was detained in February. She was basically held up at an airport near Moscow, where Russian officials say they claim that she was in possession of cannabis-derived vape cartridges. Joining us now is Mike Memoli. So, Mem, we talked about Sherelle Griner. She has been more and more vocal in, I would say, the last maybe month, 6 weeks or so, about what's going on with her wife, Brittany. She told CBS this morning it was really disheartening. She hasn't heard from President Biden yet. She wants to meet with him, and that it was actually Trevor Reed's family who says that she should, right? Here's what they told me back in March about what they had to go through to get a meeting with President Biden. Watch.
We went out there with our signs, and he saw us, and he said, he called me, and he said that he would have his staff set up a schedule for a meeting. We figured 22 days is long enough to wait, so we just decided we would come here again and just remind them that we still needed to get that meeting scheduled.
Talk about the conversations in the White House about the potential that President Biden meets with the Griner family. At what point, Mem, does the public pressure become so intense that they basically have no choice?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Hallie, because I think it's so interesting as this is playing out, how much Griner's family is playing from the Trevor Reed playbook in this situation. And let's remember, Trevor Reed was wrongfully detained, held hostage, if you want to be more blunt about it, in Russia for years. We're only talking about so far a period of weeks that Brittany Griner has been detained. Now, that feels like a lifetime for sure, and I don't want to be seen as, minimizing that at all. But it took a certain amount of public pressure just to get to the point where Trevor Reed and his family were able to get that meeting, the Reed family was, with the president, and ultimately secure his release. And I think Griner, obviously, just by the nature of her status as a star WNBA player, somebody who's played for the United States in an Olympic capacity, is a much higher profile example. And that's what I think makes this so difficult for the White House, because their playbook on their side has been to try to minimize attention to this, because they don't want to get in a situation where Russia knows they have them at the table, where they have so many more chips to play than the U.S. does. And that's really, I think, what's guiding the White House side of this. But there's no doubt that the Griner family saw that the Reed family played this very well, was able to make this personal in a way that made it almost impossible for President Biden not to act, and that's what they hope to do here as well.
The parts of the letter we've seen are gut-wrenching, right? Griner's writing about July 4th, and remember, this letter was released on July 4th, saying it hurts thinking about how I usually celebrate this day because freedom means something completely different to me this year. You just have to think about how much does this move the needle and what needs to happen for Russia to let her go, because it seems like all the conversation right now is centering around the potential for a prisoner swap. Yeah. That's how Trevor Reed got out. But the guy that's being talked about at the center of this particular prisoner swap is not a good dude, to say the least, and there's a real question mark as to whether or not the U.S. would actually do something like that.
Yeah, well, first of all, talking about Griner's letter, I mean, you talk about speaking to a constituency of one. She mentions she voted for President Biden. Right. She says she knows that he has a lot on his plate, but asks for him not to forget her, and said she believes in him. So she's certainly playing to the individual less than the president at this point. But as it relates to the a possibility of a swap here, part of what's interesting here is that I remember when the Reed swap was executed, there was a lot of discussion about how the Russian side of that trade, Yaroshenko was the name of the pilot that the Russians received in return for releasing Trevor Reed, was seen as a high-value asset that perhaps in a different environment might have secured the release of multiple Americans. At least that was the thought. But because Reed's case had become such a priority for the president, ultimately it was one for one. Well, now you have a situation where there's even more of a priority for the Russians in terms of a release. And I think part of what the White House is weighing here is, can there be more than just Griner here? That giving up this individual would mean a lot more in terms of, and it's hard to think about these people as human beings, as bargaining chips, but to be crass about it, that's the way they're thinking about this at the highest level. They want to maybe use this. That's exactly right. Yeah. And they want to think about Boot as potentially a player, as a chip here that should get more than just Griner, but potentially several other, Trevor Whalen, for example, Americans who are also detained there. But these are just very fraught conversations happening at the White House. And Karine Jean-Pierre said she was with the president when he read this letter from Brittany Griner herself today. And you can imagine the emotion involved on the president's side, who does take these things personally. And whether that is moving the needle, I think it surely is.
We're definitely going to stay on top of this story. Mike, thank you for staying on top of it. Mike Memoli, appreciate you being there. Thanks. Sticking with some international news in the UK now, where two key cabinet ministers have quit just minutes apart. Moves that are raising questions about how long Prime Minister Boris Johnson can actually stay in power. You've got the health secretary, who says he cannot continue in Johnson's government, quote, in good conscience. You've got the Treasury head saying that the government should be run, quote, properly, competently, and seriously, suggesting, of course, that Johnson is not doing any of those those. You see the Prime Minister here arriving at Downing Street not too long after the resignations. They come after a string of scandals that has those scandals have followed his leadership in the last few months. What are those scandals, you may be asking? Well, his mishandling of sexual misconduct allegations against a Conservative Party lawmaker, for example, that critics have cited. Keir Simmons is in London now to talk about all of this. Okay. It's a lot here because we all remember Partygate, quote unquote, and the calls for Boris Johnson to resign.
Yes,
then.
a lot.
He didn't. He stayed in power, right? He clung to his position. You now have these two key cabinet members, some big deal, health and finance here, that have said we cannot even in good conscience stay in this administration. Gut check. How bad is it for Boris Johnson?
Oh, it's bad. I mean, the question is right now, Hallie, whether we are at the stage, that quintessential stage in British politics, where the Prime Minister is dead, but his body's still warm. In other words, that Boris Johnson is simply going to have to go, but hasn't gone yet. And you know how ruthless British politics is. Yeah. At the moment when that landslide happens, of course, the moving trucks will be in Downing Street. He will be out with his wife and children quicker than you can say new Prime Minister. So are we there yet? Well, maybe not, because Boris Johnson, of course, defies political gravity. The trouble for Boris Johnson is that this comes down to the question of whether you can believe him. Is he honest? And does somebody who, where there are questions about his honesty, have the capability to win the next election? Because, of course, in the end, all those members of Parliament, those members of the Conservative Party, are trying to judge whether they will keep their seat when another election happens. Why is there a question over his honesty? Well, the latest one, Hallie, is a political scandal that ought to be in the British Edwardian age 100 years ago. A member of Parliament, a member of Boris Johnson's whip's office, gets blind drunk in a leather-chaired posh members' club in London, is accused of sexual impropriety, resigns from the whip's office. Boris Johnson claims he didn't know anything about prior allegations, and then it turns out that maybe he did. So again, but the same old thing with Boris Johnson. Yeah. He's a talented politician, but is he honest?
Is this the start of a revolt against him from people inside his own administration, Keir, or are these two resignations kind of the end of it? Do we have any sense at this point?
Oh, no, it's more than the start. I mean, we're right in the middle of a tsunami of resignations. I just looked down just before we came on air. There was another very junior, member of Boris Johnson's government who has put in their resignation. So, yeah, again, it's, in another era, in normal British politics, this is the point where tomorrow morning Boris Johnson is going to be walking out into Downing Street and saying, I'm out, I'm done. I can't survive. I've had a phone call from the backbench MPs who run my party. They tell me you can't get through this Prime Minister, and he would walk away. But Boris Johnson, of course, is different. He tonight here in the UK is working into the night, reappointing new members of the party to the Chancellor's job. The Chancellor resigned, the guy who runs the British economy, to various roles that have now been left vacant. Again, though, the question is, how long can the British Prime Minister hang on before that role is vacant?
A big deal announcement in the world of football today, one that has a lot of football fans shaking their heads. The family of the late NFL star Demaryius Thomas saying he had CTE before he died. If you know football, you probably know what CTE is. It's this degenerative brain disease that doctors say is caused with repeated hits to the head. It's been linked to the deaths of hundreds of former NFL players. Remember, Thomas was found dead in his home last December. He was only 33. He'd also been having seizures since a car crash in 2019. The coroner's office in Fulton County, Georgia, didn't rule on the cause of death so far. Thomas's family says besides the seizures, Thomas also struggled with conditions associated with CTE, stuff like memory loss and paranoia. They say they saw signs that he was changing, that his personality was changing a year before his death. His mother saying, quote, "His father and I hope all families learn the risks of playing football. We don't want other parents to have to lose their children like we did." Let's bring in Dr. John Torres. Dr. John, these BU researchers here say that Thomas had two conditions in parallel, the seizures and the CTE. Does that make it harder to figure out how much CTE is to blame for his death versus something else?
And Hallie, it does make it harder because although head injuries can cause CTE, head injuries can cause seizures, typically those two don't go hand in hand. CTE doesn't usually result in seizures, but we do know it results in these emotional, behavioral type issues, the headaches, those types of things, and then eventually dementia if it gets to a bad enough stage, which can also complicate the issues as far as accidents, things like that, behavioral changes, decisions they make, which could cause something like this to cause him to have the seizure because he had that head injury, which then, of course, it sounds like he might have died from as well. And so it's very complicated what's happening here, and you can't really put your finger on one thing or another. It'll be interesting to see what the pathologist, the coroner, comes up with as far as how they're going to call his death, Hallie.
The other issue is that this is kind of an invisible injury. There's also no treatment for CTE, right?
Exactly.
Like you don't know you have it, and then it's really tough to get a handle on it.
Exactly. There's no treatment for it. There's no diagnosis for it. You can't get an MRI, a CAT scan, or anything like that. To tell you, right now, the diagnosis is made posthumously on autopsies. And in a case like Demaryius Thomas, it was a type 2 CTE. There are 4 different levels of CTE. He was halfway through those levels, which means that he probably had those behavioral changes attributed to it. He probably had emotional changes attributed to it, maybe the beginnings of some dementia that could be attributed to it as well. And so we know that this typically tends to progress. But like you mentioned, there's no treatment for it. There's no diagnosis for it at this point, but they're working hard to try and get that and understand that a little better, Hallie.
You know, there was this landmark CTE research report back in 2017 that the NFL at the time talked about how, you know, they support CTE research. There are still some unanswered questions, et cetera. But you have this survey now just this year showing that half of Americans from the National Sports and Society survey saying that they think kids playing tackle football is not appropriate. I wonder how you see this trend going as a doctor, right, as somebody who is talking with families about what's best for their kids.
And I think what you're going to see is you're going to see more caution when they start talking about children playing football and family members making this decision. But I think there's a couple things you have to remember. Number one, we know those repetitive, what we call subconcussive injuries are what can lead to CTE. On top of that, we also know that there are other sports as well involved. If you look at high school, football, boys football is the #1 cause for concussions, but girls soccer is the #2 cause for concussions. So that can cause some issues as well. And so I think what's happening now, especially with football, is you're getting different entities saying different things, but football in the kids' ages are trying to do things like no head tackling, you know, making sure they understand that appropriately, limiting tackling to certain ages and above. And so I think that's certainly going to help out. And this is a sport that I think is going to be around for a while. And so I think understanding how to deal with this, how children can understand how to tackle, how to make sure their heads stay safe is going to be important, Hallie.
Dr. John Torres, thank you very much. Appreciate it. State fights on abortion unfolding now ever since Roe versus Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court. Just today in Florida, a judge reinstated that state's 15-week ban on abortion after an appeal from the state's attorney general. It had been blocked by a judge only last week. Also today in Mississippi, a judge rejected a request from the state's only abortion clinic to block a law that would ban most abortions there. That law is now supposed to go into effect this Thursday. It's coming as another debate surfaces on the role that adoption will have in this post-Roe world. You've probably seen pictures like these of folks at protests with signs saying, you know, adoption, not abortion, or we will adopt your baby. Some people who oppose abortion see adoption as a clear solution to helping women who do not want or cannot care for a child after the Supreme Court's ruling. Isa Gutierrez has spoken to some mothers who adopted, a mother who had to give up a child for adoption, about how they say the answer is just not that simple.
He's never known another home other than with a home with my husband and I.
Lihia Cushman knew she'd face hurdles when adopting her now 16-year-old son.
As an adoptive mother, I have come to understand that adoption in and of itself is difficult and complex.
Adoption numbers aren't federally tracked, but researchers say between about 100 and 140,000 children are adopted in the U.S. every year. Now, with the Supreme Court's controversial decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, the nation is bracing itself for an influx of women who might consider adoption instead of abortion.
I was able to give one child something I couldn't give my other 3 kids, a stable household with both their parents.
Shantae Johnson knows what it's like to make the difficult decision of giving a child up for adoption.
So some days I wonder if he'll hate me, if he'll resent me, or if he'll be grateful, or if he'll understand that I did it out of love and not hate.
While some opponents of abortion view adoption as a clear solution in a post-Roe world, research shows adoption isn't usually a mother's first choice.
Originally, my plan was to get an abortion. Circumstances came about to where I could not get the procedure done. I was at a loss. I thought I was going to have a 4th kid, father not actively around, financially struggling. At the time, I was homeless.
You have women who very much want to parent this child and who don't feel that they can afford that, or don't feel that they have the support in their network to make that possible and turn toward adoption.
Gretchen Sisson is a researcher at the University of California, San Francisco, who's been studying domestic and private adoption for the last 10 years. UCSF researchers now predict approximately 100,000 abortions in this country will be denied a year, resulting in an estimated 9,000 to 10,000 more private adoptions per year alone, a 50% increase.
The demand for adoptable infants is far higher than the number of infants that are relinquished for adoption. So I don't have any doubt that the private adoption system is going to be able to manage private adoptions for an increased number of infants.
Roe versus Wade got overturned. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited.
Lucrease Bundy, an adoption lawyer, celebrated when Roe was overturned. As a Christian, she says it aligned with her views.
I am praying and hoping that this is actually going to encourage a lot more adoptions in the future.
With more than 100,000 kids still waiting to be adopted in the foster care system in the U.S., Bundy is now focusing on educating hopeful couples.
We can't pretend that adoption is just the one-all answer to everything, that it somehow is a Band-Aid to abortion, because it's not.
And for adoptive mothers, often there are no easy answers.
When people say to me, like, aren't you thankful that he wasn't aborted? Of course I am. And at the same time, I think that women have the right to choose when they become mothers.
Issa is joining us now. And Issa, you mentioned in your piece how many thousands of kids in the foster care system are still waiting to be adopted. What are the factors into how that works? Who actually gets adopted out of the system?
So 2 big factors, Hallie, that we have to talk about are race and age. Data shows that they play a big role in who gets adopted and who might not as quickly, right? So in 2018, data from the Annie E. Casey Foundation found that Black children, as well as American Indian and Alaska Native children, make up highly disproportionate rates when it comes to those kids who are waiting to be adopted right now in the U.S. Now, when we talk about age, that's also really interesting. In the last decade, data showed that older children were less likely to be adopted. A study from NYU and Caltech finding in 2010 that right after birth, children immediately are less likely to be adopted than while still in the womb. However, that seems to be changing lately with higher rates of older children getting adopted. But all of this really interesting to think about, especially when we think about who this impacts. Hallie?
Issa Gutierrez, thank you so much for that reporting. Appreciate it. Coming up, a federal judge ruling in favor of 3 big drug distributors in a lawsuit over the opioid crisis. That's coming up in the local. Plus, a Long Island lifeguard says he fought off a shark. How he did it and what experts say you can do to stay safe at the beach. Next. NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day, and because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our Southeast Bureau, a federal judge has ruled in favor of 3 big drug distributors in a landmark opioid case in West Virginia. Cabell County and the city of Huntington were devastated by the opioid crisis. They accused distributors of being behind that crisis. They wanted them to pay more than $2.5 billion for drug treatment programs. The companies put the blame on an increase in prescriptions, more prescriptions written by doctors, and pill quotas set by federal agents. The lawsuit was the first time allegations involving opioid distribution ended up at a federal trial, and it could have a big impact on similar lawsuits. Also from our Southeast Bureau, the CDC is linking a national listeria outbreak to a Florida-based ice cream company. There have been 23 reports of listeria, people getting sick from listeria, and 1 death across multiple states, linked to the Big Olaf Creamery, starting in January. The creamery has responded, saying it's not sure why it is being, quote, mentioned or targeted, and that there's no confirmation that any listeria link exists. From our West Coast Bureau, the San Jose Sharks have named former player Mike Greer as the new GM there. He's the first black GM in NHL history. Greer played for 4 teams, including the Sharks. His brother, Chris Greer, is the Miami Dolphins GM. Let's talk about a different shark now, the real kind. How's that for a transition, folks? That's how we do it in the news biz, right? We talk about sharks, we talk about beaches, and on Long Island, those beaches are back open. But officials there are warning people to watch out after a shark bit a lifeguard over the weekend. We want to warn you, if you're a little squeamish about stuff that's, you know, icky, avert your eyes at the moment. I might have to avert mine because we're about to show you the hand and chest of Zach Gallo. You can see punctures from the shark bite there. Gallo was mimicking a swimmer during a training exercise, so he was imitating what a swimmer would do. And when he felt that pinch, you know what he did? Did he freak out? Did he scream? Did he run away? No, he started punching at the water. Listen.
Survival instincts kind of kicked in, and, you know, kind of just like, get away, get away, get away. And, you know, once I saw the tail whip me in the chest and the arm, and I saw what it was, that's when I knew I had to get all my guys into the water, out of the water.
Carrie Sanders is joining us now. Carrie, you know, it's not just this guy, this Gallo here. You had sharks that killed 2 women in Egypt. A Florida teen may have to have her leg amputated just from this weekend alone. But I also want to give people a context check. It's not like this is happening everywhere at all times. It's still very rare. They're scary, but they're not all that frequent, right?
You know, it's the fact that it is news should point out that it is unusual. Right. We talk about it because it doesn't happen every day. And so it's like we don't really talk about car accidents every day. They happen all the time. Shark attacks are unusual. And to sort of give you some perspective, the International Shark Attack File, which collects data from around the world. Let's take a look at the graphic here. This is almost 200 years worth of data. And you can see, based on where you live along the coast or maybe a beach that you go to when you go on vacation, how really rare it is over almost 200 years. Most of the attacks you'll probably be drawn to are down in Florida, and most of them are in the New Smyrna Beach, Daytona Beach area. But there's a very good reason that there have been close to 900 attacks there, is because it's very popular with surfers, and at the same time, the underwater geography is conducive for sharks. And so there's a mix there. And so that's why you see so many there. But again, you know, we just had 4th of July. You're more likely to be killed by fireworks than you are to be killed by a shark, Hallie.
That is critical context, Gary. But there's this interesting study that I wanted to talk to you about, because there's this study that happened recently near Miami and found that, you know, you might think that, hey, if there's a crowded beach, sharks would want to stay away, right? Typically, carnivores, you know, not humans, might do that. But that's actually not happening. They're saying that they're kind of urban adapters here, partly because water is getting warmer due to climate change, right? I found this interesting. Help us understand this.
Well, Dr. Neil Hammerschlag at the Rosenstiel School at the University of Miami conducted the study. He was looking along the East Coast at sharks coming closer to shore and trying to figure out whether that was the case. And indeed, his study does show not only are they coming closer to shore, but that they are actually moving closer to shore as the temperatures rise. I mean, everybody knows the great white. That's the one that everybody's most scared about. Mm-hmm. Great whites spend most of their time in the first 100 feet of the ocean because that's where the warmer water is, and that's where they like to go. So the study sort of bears this out. And yes, it can sound scary, but there isn't a correlation between sharks being closer to shore and people getting attacked by sharks. And that's because the experts say repeatedly their studies show that sharks are not hunting humans, which probably circles back to the statistic, which is it's a very rare event when this happens.
Great point.
And it's usually a case, the experts say, of a shark doing a mistaken identity, thinking that maybe it's a seal or something else, and then spitting the human out.
I mean, I think about that lifeguard who his first instinct was to start punching the water, right? Like, super smart. I got to tell you, I don't know what I would do. Like, not dressed like a seal, obviously, Carrie, to stay safe in the water. But, like, are there things that we should be thinking about when we go to the beach? Because 99% of the time, Carrie, unless I've just seen you on the Today Show, I'm not thinking about sharks at the beach where I go.
Well, 17-year-old Addison Bethea here in Florida did something that was reactive. She started poking the bull shark's eyes and digging her hands into the gills, which are areas that are sensitive to the sharks that may have caused the release. But if you're going to the beach, you know, the things that you should think about is staying out of the water at dusk and dawn, because that's when the sharks are feeding closer to shore. They see what they think might be the bait fish closer. If you're wearing jewelry, that looks like bait fish flashing under the water. And ultimately, if you're in a group in the water or at a beach with a lifeguard, you're probably doing the right thing. Hallie?
Carrie Sanders, appreciate you. Thank you for being on, talking us through that. Thanks. Still to come, hacking concerns, not only about your phone or your computer, but maybe you or your parents or your grandparents' pacemaker. Cybersecurity experts say it's possible, and it could happen with other medical devices, too. We'll talk about what the government is doing about it next. So tonight's original now with in-depth reporting on a topic we've been keeping an eye on. You know, stuff like pacemakers or insulin pumps, stuff that's implanted into your body. They can be lifesavers for so many people, but they can also be hacked. In theory, this means that, like, let's say a foreign spy could maybe hack the device of a CIA officer to transmit data from inside someplace secure where cell phones aren't allowed. Or criminals could threaten thousands of implanted medical devices and demand ransoms from victims. These are, again, in theory, connecting the dots down the road. But we had Ken Delaney take a look at some of these concerns, talk to a cybersecurity consultant who managed to hack a pacemaker, just like the one she has in her own heart. Watch.
It sounds like something out of a spy drama, hacking into a medical device inside a human body with lethal results. Just such a scenario played out a decade ago in the Showtime series Homeland, when terrorists killed the fictional vice president with a massive shock delivered remotely through his pacemaker. Experts say it could happen in real life.
It's possible to hack pacemakers. You could also hack other types of medical devices like insulin pumps, for instance. I mean, this could have bad consequences.
Computer expert Marie Moe has more than a professional interest in the cybersecurity of medical devices.
So about 10 years ago, my heart suddenly stopped. That's why I needed a pacemaker. Essentially, I have a condition called heart block. The signaling inside the heart isn't working correctly, which can cause arrhythmias.
Pacemakers and other devices connect wirelessly to base stations that can adjust their settings. Peter Pitts, a former Food and Drug Administration official, says that poses a risk.
In my opinion, anything that's wired to the internet is susceptible right now to cyber break-ins, to healthcare terrorism. And shame on us if we wait until something happens that's deadly to solve the problem. We have to act on it, and right now.
In 2020, Moe exposed vulnerabilities in medical device cybersecurity that were so serious, the federal government issued a warning.
We actually were able to set up a fake base station in the lab that could connect to the device that is connecting to the pacemaker. You could, as an attacker, insert yourself into that communication and potentially change the messages that are going back and forth.
After years of debate, the FDA recently issued draft guidance for cybersecurity in medical devices, but it's only voluntary.
It's not enough to say that this is voluntary. I think it needs to be mandatory. We didn't use seat belts in cars, and then it was required, and you had to do it. And now, I mean, everyone does it, and it doesn't feel like it's a problem to use a seat belt.
Moe and other experts consider assassination by medical device a remote possibility. But given how often hackers have blackmailed hospitals by freezing their computer networks with ransomware, they say it's a threat that should not be ignored.
Ken Delaney is joining us now. You know, Ken, it is just extraordinary, I think, to watch and to listen to and to learn about But we also have to point out, like, that in theory could be scary, a hack of a pacemaker. What in practicality, what in actuality is scary are ransomware attacks on hospitals, which are way, way more common, right?
No, that's exactly right, Hallie. And in fact, those two things are related. Both medical devices and hospital IT systems are considered to be relatively easy targets for hackers because they often run outdated software full of security flaws. Some surveys have shown that 42% of hospitals have been hit by ransomware attacks in recent years, and cybersecurity experts I spoke to say it's probably higher. And these attacks don't just cost hospitals money, they put patients at risk. And in fact, back in 2019, a newborn's death in the middle of a ransomware attack in an Alabama hospital was attributed to fetal monitors being down. Yet there are no government rules setting minimum cybersecurity standards in hospitals, Hallie.
Ken Delaney, and thank you so much for that reporting. President Biden today awarding 4 Vietnam Army veterans the military's highest honor, men who served in different battles in different years, but who all put themselves in danger to protect their fellow soldiers. One medal was awarded posthumously to Staff Sergeant Edward Kaneshiro, who died from his wounds in 1967. His son accepted his award on his behalf, the medal. Specialist 5 Dwight W. Birdwell, Specialist 5 Dennis M. Fuji, and Major John J. Duffy also received their medals for refusing evacuation to help fellow soldiers after they themselves were hurt by enemy fire. A special day at the White House. Thanks again for joining us here in Washington. We'll have more for you here tomorrow, same time, same place. Coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.